All right, everybody, let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the 2024 Interagency WFDSS Agency Administrator Refresher. My name is Casey Shedden. I'm a Fire Management Specialist with the WFM RD&A, and I'm on the Classic Business team. A little bit of situational awareness on what we're going to be talking about today. This webinar will be recorded and hosted at the WFM RD&A Agency Administrator Toolbox upon completion. Additionally, the same recording will be posted on the Wildland Fire Learning Portal. For all the Forest Service AAs on the call today, please stay to the end of the presentation, and I'll walk you through the process to get your completion certificate. It's been a while since we've used Zoom, so we're going to go over a little bit of a refresher on using Zoom. If you guys have a question for each speaker, use the raise hand option at the bottom. The staff, if you have a question, will unmute you, and then you can ask the question to the presenter. And also, if you feel more comfortable, the chat is available for those same questions. Please share the questions with the group, because if you have that question, someone has that same question, they can share that with the speaker. We'll be closing out each question, or the questions for each presenter. So if you have a question for a specific presenter, please get those in on time. And then we'll kind of go at the end of the presentation if you have further needs that we can address at that time. Now, a little agenda of what we have going on today. It's posted on the screen for you. We have a diverse group of presenters to bring you relevant information to the AA role. And then we'll have updates on WFDSS and NextGen WFDSS at the end of the webinar. Please take time to see the staff that is responsible for the webinar and the WFDSS products. They're listed on the left there, as well as the presenters that have volunteered their time to discuss relevant topics facing the AA role. I also want to acknowledge Tisa Street, Public Affairs Specialist with the WO Enterprise team, who will be helping with any technical issues behind the scenes if they arise. And we have posted that reference document. So any links that you see in this presentation, they're in the chat right now. All right, I want to introduce Edward Hunter Jr., who is the Deputy Regional Forester for State, Private, Tribal Forestry for the USDA Forest Service Southern Region. He's based in Atlanta, Georgia. He's responsible for the Fire and Aviation, Forest Health, and Cooperative Forestry Unit. Ed currently serves as the chair for the National Line Officer team. Go ahead, Ed.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Ed.
All right. Thanks, Casey. And for some of you, I assume it's still morning. So good morning to you. And thank you all for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to start us off by talking a bit about the agency's approach to wildfire response. As you all know, our priority is to protect the health, safety, and well-being of the fire management community and the public we serve. Our federal agency, along with our sister agencies and all of our partners, tribal nations, state and local partners, private industry, and volunteers stand together, ready to respond to wildfires again this year. Our Forest Service policy ensures that every fire receives a strategic risk-based response that's appropriate for the circumstances and the associated threats and opportunities that we face. Each of those strategies uses the full spectrum of management actions that consider fire and fuels conditions, weather values at risk, and resource availability. As you all know, where wildfires threaten lives, communities, and homes, we will actively use all available strategies and tools to suppress those fires and their growth. Our focus is on making sound, science-based, risk-informed decisions. And as you all know, our goal is to minimize the number of destructive large wildfires. Our local ground resources, which include federal and non-federal, which are supported also by our available air tankers and helicopters, work together whenever possible to contain these fires safely and effectively. And because of these efforts, 98% of all wildfires are contained within 24 hours of initial response, and less than 2% become large fires we often see in the media. And that's a special thanks to you, the decisions that you make, and the well-trained staff that we have. As you all know, our agency aspires to onboard 11,300 wildland firefighters by mid-July when we get to our busiest. These wildland firefighters will be highly trained in emergency response and can quickly adapt to changing situations. Providing critical wildfire response is becoming increasingly difficult given the tendency for fires to become exceedingly large and displaying extreme fire behavior. That coupled with an increase in the wildland-urban interface. Wildfires are exacerbated by our hotter and drier climate, and we are witnessing unprecedented wildfire behavior fueled by overly dense forests and high fuel loads. And this is also amplified by severe drought and pushed by high winds, typically in the summers. Fighting fire in these conditions mean we need to make strategic, risk-based, and often difficult decisions about where and how to deploy firefighters and aviation assets safely. If the situation requires unacceptable risk to our responders, or if there's a likelihood of success to be low, our fire managers will implement strategies and tactics where the level of risk is unacceptable, where it is acceptable, and the probability of success is reasonable, rather than commit firefighters to operations. And so all of the decisions that we make around management of wildfires need to be documented in WFDSS. And that's why we're here today. We have an unbelievable staff who have developed tools to be used at our discretion. And these strategic risk tools and discussions, including the incident strategic alignment process and the risk management assistant dashboard, help to inform our decisions and help us to document those in WFDSS. They also help us with our course of action, our rationale, and our objectives. Again, you all do a great job of bringing clarity to a lot of chaos that we see out there, and also to do a great job of keeping all of our resources safe. And so today we'll hear from a number of professionals within our community who will help us gain a greater understanding. Lastly, I want you all to know that this is a safe place for us to ask questions, to be curious, but most importantly, to build community among each other. This should be an interesting year, as is any other year. So I encourage you to put your questions in the chat, reach out to us individually if you feel more comfortable, but let's learn and grow together. And so with that, I will turn it back to you, Casey, for further instructions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, for that kickoff. Does anybody have any questions for Ed at this time? All right. If you have any questions with our next speakers, please put those in the chat. I am going to now introduce Dennis Strange, who is the State Fire Management Officer for BLM Idaho, as well as the Interagency Cooperation and Agreements author, interpreter, and implementer. And also assisting with this discussion will be Ben Newbern, who is the Director of Fire and Aviation Management in the Intermountain Region for the U.S. Forest Service. In his role, he oversees fire management activities in 5 Western states with a staff of 1,300 personnel. I am going to turn off my screen and then Dennis will pick up.
Okay, so we're going to get this going here. There we go. All right.
Thanks, Dennis.
Okay, looking good from your end there.
Yep, we got you.
All right, hello, everybody. Like Casey said, my name is Dennis Strange. I'm the BLM Idaho Fire Management Officer for the state here in Idaho, BLM. And what we want to do today is we want to talk about the interagency fire master agreements. Some of you may know them as the Stafford Act or covering other different items. But what Ben and I want to do is just kind of raise some general awareness, especially as an agency and administrator. If you're going outside the area that you normally work in, this agreement is definitely going to have some implications for how you go about your business and what you want to do there. But like has already been mentioned, interaction is fantastic. You know, we've been stuck in virtual land for a bit now, but we've also seen that it can provide a great opportunity to get a lot of folks in a minimal amount of time with low cost. And so let's make sure that this virtual opportunity is an enhancement and not a hindrance to our interaction and our ability to learn from each other. Lots of you folks have great experience out there. You've been there, you've done that. Let's share it with folks. Putting a quick thing in the chat is great. If you have a question, please raise your hand so we can make sure that we know that that's something that you want to contribute in a live sense there. But we'll be asking some questions. Go ahead and put those in the chat and bring your comments to the group so we can move from there. Ben, you want to introduce yourself there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dennis. And hello, everybody. Again, Ben Newbern, the Regional Fire Director in the Intermountain region in the Great Basin area out west. And as Dennis said, we're going to spend some time today talking about master agreements, the why behind them, how they're to be utilized, what they do, and also some things of what they don't do. And then get into some of the more finer points around things like cost shares and such. So Dennis, if you could advance the slide.
Yeah.
There we go. So again, why a master agreement? You know, and I think we all have enough experience to know that wildfires tend to not obey fence lines and boundaries. And so we wind up with fires that either threaten or physically affect multiple jurisdictions. And so the master agreement is one of those tools that we use to define how we do business with one another between the federal agencies and the states. And we'll get into that a little bit more with who's involved in master agreements and also who's not involved and how other agreements might play in or partner with this agreement to do some of that work. Some of the things that the master agreement may speak to or get work around, but does not necessarily specifically outline, is how we provide for coordination and prioritization of incidents, and think about the mobilization system through our dispatch centers and coordination centers, things like that. The main intent for a master agreement, of course, is to cover the business side of fire, and that is how we reconcile and implement a response plan to an incident or to a geographic area. Normally, those are limited to state boundaries. There are a few examples where they may be something less than a state, but because they're normally entered into between federal partners and a state, they're normally drawn to a state boundary. One of the things to think about is these master agreements, and one of the key components to it is getting out in front of the situation that would occur them to be needed. And so as the bullet point mentions here on the slide at the bottom, there is a preemptive authorization to establish this process to do business. So we're not doing a separate agreement for every time you have a fire that might threaten another jurisdiction and needing to establish that relationship in the heat of the moment. Dennis?
Yeah, exactly. Good points, Ben. So, you know, that's really where the master agreement helps us out is, you know, we have a lot of processes in place in fire, as we all know. One of those being that coordination. And so what this master agreement does is that helps us capitalize on that, right? And so we have those processes in place. How exactly we go about that and what we're going to do that in a very local sense within a state, that's what we're going to get at with the master agreement. So let's get a little bit into where we get those authorities from, right? So as we all know, as agency administrators and professionals in the Wildland Fire Service, we have to have authorities to go about how we do our things. And this really helps us provide that guiding, this is what the intent was, this is what we want done. And so let's go over a little bit of the authorities that are going to be utilized in the master agreement and around the master agreement. So let's kick this off with some interaction here. So in the chat, can anyone tell me what the Economy Act of 1932 covers? All right, so this is where you realize that, oh, I'm not just gonna be able to sit there the whole time. This is actual interaction. Yes, the chat is up, the chat is working. Someone reach out there. Economy Act of 1932. We use it in a lot of different ways. Awesome. Rhonda, appreciate you going first and putting it out there. Okay. Good. Yeah, we're getting some good responses there. That's exactly right. Let's see. Ethan McKinley nailed it there. So that is the act that allows federal agencies to buy things from each other. So prior to that point, it was actually illegal for one agency to give appropriated funds to another agency. So yeah, Economy Act of 1932. What was happening in 1932? Great Depression, right? So this act really came about as a method to be more economical in how Congress and the federal government is using the public funds that has been given to them. Very good. All right, Reciprocal Fire Protection Act of 1955. What does that give us? Okay, so thank you, Alan. Anybody else? Okay, so this is where everyone's like, oh, hey, there's 4 of them right there. I can Google, I can get ahead on this. Good, yeah, put it in the chat. That's all right. That's an acceptable way. But yeah, agreement between the feds and the state, right? The key point there is reciprocal, right? So reciprocal by its definition means that we have to have a reasonable expectation that we're going to be trading something of similar value, right? So if we do this action, you're going to do that action, and in the big scheme of things, they're going to equal out more or less. There's no requirement in the Reciprocal Fire Protection Act that we have a to the penny recounting of every action that's taken back and forth, and that it really is fair. There's a lot of latitude given to the agencies of what reciprocal means. So a lot of it goes back to the intent and then the application on the ground of what it looks like and what it means and how we go forward from there. All right, good. Next one, Stafford Act of 1988. Good, yes. Okay. So FEMA itself is FEMA, right? Stafford Act gives the authority for the federal entities to help participate in local and regional emergencies. So remember, FEMA is there for federally declared disasters. So that's taken care of. And we have the ESF ESF functions that are going to come right in with that the federal agencies can take part of. But Stafford Act goes a little bit further than that. That's going to help us if we need to help locally. So let's put it out there, agency administrators. Here you are. You're in your district or your field office or your region, wherever you're working that day. And right now, you get a call from one of your cooperators that you have a relationship with, and they say, hey, the river is flooding. We're about to lose this housing community. I need some folks that can come and help out. Can we do that? Is that allowed? Okay, Ted, excuse me. Ted says yes. Vernon agrees. All right. Yes, a lot of people are saying yes. That's exactly right. That's what the Stafford Act gets us. It's that opportunity. The challenge that comes with it is what that act allows us to do is expend appropriated funds that Congress gave the agencies to do its normal job. Responding to local emergencies is not our normal job. But the Stafford Act says it's okay if you use those funds to do that. What it doesn't do is establish funds to do that. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind as agency administrators, that, yeah, we can go and help. We're authorized to do that. We're totally covered while we do it. But there's no pot somewhere that we're going to be able to draw from to help with that local. Now, if that emergency gets ratcheted up and it becomes a federally declared disaster, then yes, we can go through a reimbursement process through FEMA and so on and so forth. But if it stays local, or even if it goes to the state, there isn't anything there. So that's something to keep in mind. But the Stafford Act is one of those elements that is covered in our master agreement. Okay, last one, Wyden Amendment to the Omnibus Appropriations Act of 1999. What does that give us? Ooh, Tim was ready. Thanks, Tim. That's exactly right. Allows us to expend funds off of the federal lands, specifically private lands, okay? We can go spend appropriation dollars on non-federal lands, thank you, Brian, to show that, hey, this is a good thing. There's one key word that's in that amendment that has to be part of it. Does anyone know what that key word is? All of you are getting to the in the text, adjacent lands, watershed, good guesses, I like it. Adjacent, the word is nexus. We have to have a nexus to the federal land. So adjacent is usually the convenient interpretation of that, but making sure that we have a nexus so that it is beneficial to the federal lands to include this. Now that can include that, hey, if we want to do a prescribed fire, and right here on this ridge is a natural break that we want to take advantage of, but there's a private section right here. We need to go get that. Instead of cutting line downhill and trying to make a corner mid-slope, we can incorporate those private lands. We can spend money on those private lands. It's definitely a nexus to the federal agencies and the lands that are right next to it. And so that's what we're going to go with it. All right, great answers. Ben, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think you covered it quite well. Always enjoy hearing you talk about policy.
Very good.
So,
you're up.
Yeah, thanks. So let's take a minute here and on the next slide and talk about other agreements and how they relate to our master agreements and some that are parallel to but are not master agreements. In this first slide, we're going to talk about some national level agreements that establish the way we work together, mainly amongst the federal agencies. And so the first example of that is the 5-agency agreement or the 5-agency master agreement. And can anybody name what those 5 agencies might be? My guess is most of them are represented here in the audience. Dennis and I happen to represent 2 of them. There we go. Yeah, thank you, Mark. So it's the 4 bureaus out of the Department of Interior that have land management designations and jurisdictions, and then of course the Forest Service out of the Department of Agriculture. And so really what we're talking about here is an agreement that allows those 5 agencies that have jurisdiction over the vast majority of public lands in the United States to do business together, fed to fed. And I think you guys, particularly as agency administrators and fire professionals, have ran into this experience before, and you hear things, kind of slang like things like feds don't bill feds and such. That's all stemming from the 5-agency master agreement that allows us to do business back and forth and create some efficiencies there. And so we're not doing a bunch of agreements to do individual work when we're all in it for the same thing. There's another agreement that is very similar to that adds the Department of Defense. So as many of you are aware, the Department of Defense is a fairly large land manager in the country. They obviously have a few nuances that are different than the Department of Interior and Department of Ag agencies, and their enabling legislation, going back to the previous slide, keeps them from being able to get into some of the agreements that we're able to do through the Stafford Act, the Reciprocal Fire Act, things like that. And so the 5-agency and DoD agreement brings DoD in some places to be able to work across those boundaries and onto bases and places where we need to have reciprocal actions and recognize largely in when it hits the ground is bringing in the federal land management agencies to assist the DoD in the management of those lands, particularly around fire management, both planned and unplanned ignitions. And for those of you that have DoD units near you, you're probably very familiar with this as we provide assistance to them. Not so much the other way around, although that is changing quite a bit. We're starting to see DoD play a bigger role, particularly around becoming a member of NWCG. And so bringing us to the third bullet there, how we've all heard about NWCG. NWCG is not a place. There isn't an org chart for it. People don't occupy positions necessarily that are NWCG specific positions. They're the member agencies, particularly the federal agencies, coming together to form the way we govern wildland fire response and the coordinated response as the 5 agencies that are tied to these other masters. And so think about how we do our business, how we create process, how we coordinate with one another. The NWCG agreement is really implemented more like an MOU, where there is no financial trade. We all show up with our own pockets of money. We pay our own way into doing that work, but it provides us the baseline or the foundation for us to be able to do that coordinated work together. And that's things like produce training curriculum, coordinating standards, things of that sort. You guys have all, I'm sure, seen NWCG memos and stuff like out there that provide guidance into the system. And that's where that comes from, or at least the authorization for that comes from. And yes, thank you, Natalie, for those that, if I throw out acronyms that aren't understood, if somebody does know what they are, please put them in the chat. So National Wildfire Coordinating Group. So represented by the 5 agencies plus the State Foresters Association are the main players. DoD is becoming a bigger player in that, as well as FEMA and some of the Homeland Security agencies. The DoD master agreement information, we can provide that for you. Let's do that outside of this. And so if you want to just reach out to me, I'm in the directory, should be pretty easy to find. And we can connect you with the information around the DoD master agreement, rather than take up more time here on that, since it is somewhat specialized and does not necessarily touch everybody here in the room. So with that, Dennis, any comments there, or onto the other slide?
Yeah, I think you covered it there, Ben. One thing I just want to point out is NWCG, there is no change of money there, right? So it's just like Ben was saying, it's an MOU that, hey, we're all going to do this job this way, and we agree to do it. So right on. All right, so Ben touched on some of those master agreements that we have nationally. Let's talk about some of the things that aren't a master agreement, because that's one way that we learn, right? Compare and contrast of what is and what isn't. So a couple things a couple examples that aren't master agreements. One of them being a local agreement. Now, different agencies have had just some different interpretations in the last 10 years or so as far as local agreements, but we can all remember them, and some agencies still utilize them. But a local agreement is very specialized. It's going to be local. It's going to have just a very defined area, very defined signatories, and it's going to be very prescriptive on what you're doing. Great thing about local agreements is that we can get that specific, and we can say, hey, this is how we're going to treat this area. This is how we're going to treat this circumstance. And it helps us, and it's a very good tool, but it's not a master agreement. It is not encompassing a greater area and multiple agencies or partners. It's usually 2 partners that say, hey, this is what we want to do in this area. Next one, cohesive strategy. I hope you're all familiar with the cohesive strategy. It's not an agreement at all. Can anyone tell me who is involved in the cohesive strategy? Give me a one-word answer of who's involved in the cohesive strategy. Yeah, Philip nailed it. There we go. We're on it. Yeah, everyone. And that's something that we have to remember. We get so dug into these agreements and what the specifics are and who it covers and who it doesn't. But the cohesive strategy gives us a great opportunity to pull back and say, hey, this is an everyone thing. This is how we get to involve everyone and get going with it. The biggest point that we can make here is what the cohesive strategy not being an agreement. Again, there's no exchange of funds. It is a set of ideals and principles that we want to work forward and make sure that we're making good decisions that we can all agree on need to be elements of part of those decisions. That's what our cohesive strategy gets us. So not a master agreement. What about an MOU? What's the big difference of an MOU versus an agreement? Give me some answers out there. There we go. Yep. Vernon, John, thank you. Good job. You got it. So less formal, not so much. MOU can be very formal. There's some MOUs of national scope. MOUs are signed. MOUs are there. But the biggest thing is that there's no money tied to it. So if you're just agreeing that, hey, if you do this, I'll do that, but we're not going to exchange funds, and MOU is a great vehicle for that. But if we are in a situation where we do need to exchange funds on any level, that's when we go to an agreement. So MOUs, maybe what the responder was meaning is that it's less formal, that we don't have to go through quite the process to get them in place. That's absolutely correct. MOUs can be very fluid. They can be very straightforward, and they're a great tool to use. Don't put yourself in a corner thinking that, oh, I need to make an agreement with someone when an MOU will do. So give yourself an opportunity to compare and contrast on that and find what the best vehicle is. Easiest one is if it doesn't involve money, MOU might be the way you want to go. All right. And the last one, a contract or a fee for service. We wanted to cover this one because a lot of times people get confused and they call the master agreement a contract, or even a local agreement, they'll call it a contract. The biggest thing that we need to take out of here is obligation. When we have a contract, we are saying one party will render this service and the other party will pay for that service. And so we have to be careful that when we're talking about our master agreement and more a lot of the times in our local agreements, there isn't that obligation. What we're really doing in our master agreement is we're providing that opportunity. If we have an opportunity that we're going to help each other, and if we decide that we're going to go do it, this is how we're going to go do it. This is what we're going to have. And so that's the one thing that we want to have. Oh, John, great point. No mutual benefit on the contracts. Very good. Yeah, it's going to be one-sided. Hey, I need this done. You're going to provide it for me. I'm going to give you money. We're going to move forward with it. It can serve a purpose. There are going to be times where we're going to have this, but it's not necessarily going to be an interagency contract. Very often we do that with the outside the government. But remember, the obligation is the point. And what we really want to take for the take-home point on that is when we're talking about our master agreement, there is no obligation within there. It's an understanding of how we want to go about business should business come about. And that's important when we're talking with our other partners and what we're expecting from them. Ben, you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, the only thing that I'd bring up is an example of that contract, although it's not a contract, it is technically an agreement that covers fee for service you find in California with the CFAA, the California Fire Assistance Agreement, that is different than the master agreement there, and that enables the federal agencies and the state, CAL FIRE in this case, to work through Cal OES to get local government resources. There's no exchange of protection. There's no other components that you would typically see in a master agreement. It's simply a way to access those local government resources in a fee-for-service manner to support state and federal missions. So a good example of that last bullet there.
Yeah, great example. Thank you.
Yeah. So as far as the elements of a master agreement, one of the first things we need to think about is who all needs to be at the table. Who are going to be signing the document? And we mentioned the agencies earlier. The 5 federal agencies sign the master agreements with the state, and then also the state agency that has wildfire protection responsibilities or jurisdiction for that state. Oftentimes there's other entities that want to come in and be participatory in that agreement. They show up in a number of different places. Think about out west, you've got things like timber protection associations or rural fire protection associations. Certain contractors that have enough influence might try to suggest that they want to be involved. Sometimes the local government departments you'll see show up, especially if they have a lot of influence and want to participate in that. Unfortunately, if you look back to the legislation that was detailed in that first slide that Dennis talked about, there really isn't any mechanism for them to do that. Now, the difference there, and one thing that people should really look at when they're engaging in activities around a master agreement is what authorities the state agency that signed the master agreement has. Different states have different authorities for that state agency to engage with those parties. A great example in Idaho, where Dennis works and I spend time, is the state of Idaho through the Idaho Department of Lands has authority to basically represent the timber protection associations that we have in the state as basically a member of IDL or as an actor for IDL. And so you'll see them get brought in that way. But at the end of the day, it's that state agency that has the authority to be signing for a non-federal partner in that legislation that Dennis pointed out earlier in the presentation. Some other things to think about, especially for some of the bigger agencies here, the Forest Service and the BLM primarily, is oftentimes we work in geographic areas or in states that the other federal agencies may not have a large presence in, but they're still signatures to the agreement because, even if they just have a little postage stamp, they have an interest and values that need to be represented. And so make sure you bring those players in early, whether it's negotiating a master agreement or just implementing the master agreement when an incident occurs. If you bring them in late in the game, their values, some of their processes related to their agencies specifically may hamstring our ability to do the business that we want to do. And so make sure that they get included early and often, and don't try to overlook them. Similarly, look at the boundaries for your agreement. Oftentimes we think within geographic areas or regions, specifically for the Forest Service, the BLM tends to have a lesser issue with this because their regional boundaries are typically the state boundaries. But there's a lot of examples where our geographic area boundaries that are defining our mobilization practices and things like that do not line up on state lines. They follow some sort of geographic barrier, like a mountain ridge or a drainage or something like that. And so you wind up with states that have multiple master agreements that they're interacting with, and or the federal agencies' boundaries don't line up with those state boundaries. So be very aware of that and think about how that might implicate the work that you're doing. There's many land management units out there that might wind up sitting with multiple master agreements that they have to implement on, depending on where they're working. And then, I already talked about the local entities. I'll pass over that. The other thing, when we talk about that second bullet there about precedent, it's very easy to get stuck in a rut. And these are 5-year agreements, just like our typical authorities. We try to push them out to 5 years. And it's something that we get stuck in culturally around, the way we've always done business, and we continue doing business that same way. It's just the easy button way to move things along. But things are constantly changing. Obviously, the wildfire environment that we find ourselves in has gotten more and more complex, more and more dynamic. And so 5 years ago, things looked very different than they do today. Does your master agreement still cover all the things it needs to cover? Are there lessons that have been learned? What do we need to apply moving forward? And taking the time to really look at that, looking at all the partners at the table and making sure that they're represented and all their issues are being heard is very important as we go back and renegotiate the master agreement. If you're not in the business of master agreement negotiations, you certainly are implementing those, and the lessons learned out on the ground when we have incidents occurring and we're practicing these master agreements need to feed into that. And so think about how you're sharing those lessons learned from your incidents up to those that are negotiating the master agreement for the state that you're working in, and making sure that you're able to tell that story so that it gets caught into the next negotiation period and the new agreement that might be coming out. And then the last bullet point there, talking about operating plan. So we have the master agreement itself, and that really is the overarching policy-driven document that talks about the way in which we're going to do business, what we're going to do together. We're going to work together collectively. We're going to bill each other a certain way. The operating plan is really the more tactical document that ties to the master agreement and talks about the how. How are we going to implement the master agreement? They used to be called annual operating plans. We've tried working away from calling them annual because they really don't need to be yearly documents. They can be updated whenever it's appropriate to do so. Generally, we speak to outside of the season, we gather up and talk about changes to an operating plan. But the terms of the operating plan are really in place until rescinded or edited in some way, or for the life of the agreement. And so we probably need to reframe the way we think about our OPs and what used to be called an AOP. So think about that and what that might mean for you. Operating plans exist at a statewide level. So each master agreement should have an operating plan. And then tiered off of that, you'll often find a dispatch area or a local management unit or something like that that might have a local operating plan that tiers to that master and speaks even more succinctly to how things work at that local area specific to the master agreement. And so as we get into things, the operating plan is that nimble document, that document that we can adjust as we go along. We learn lessons within that 5-year period and really speaks to the relationship that occurs on the ground. We'll talk more about that and how we truly work through the master agreement and apply it in a future slide. But think about your operating plans and things that you've needed to change or that you have changed. And as an example, how much work have you done on your master agreement within that 5-year cycle? And it's basically cast in stone. Dennis, thoughts on that?
I think you covered it. I appreciate it. All right, so let's go to the next piece. So understanding needs, right? So we have to have that basic understanding to make sure that we're going to have a good agreement. So let's talk a little bit about that. Protection, response, responsibility, and legal authority. A lot of terms are going to get bounced around there. Jurisdiction is another one that's going to be bounced around there. And what we want to hone in on is, who has the responsibility, is the word I'm going to use, the responsibility that's been given them by their legislative body. And so that's one reason when Ben was going through, who do you bring into the table? Folks that don't have that responsibility aren't necessarily going to be part of your agreement because they don't have a responsibility that they can share that load with the rest of the group, the rest of the partners. So whether it be a TPA, a Timber Protection Association, or an RFPA, a Rural Fire Protection Association, those don't necessarily have an obligation to the public to take care of that resource. They're certainly part of the equation, certainly good partners that we need to have in it, but they wouldn't be necessarily a signatory to the master agreement. So just as an illustration, it can get complex. Ben mentioned earlier about the Idaho Department of Lands that is here in Idaho. Like many Northwest states, their responsibility is for a resource. Their responsibility is for those trees to protect them so that they can be a source of revenue for the state and for the local economies. They don't necessarily have just lands. They also have lands, but that has a very unique stance they're going to be looking at. The Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, they have defined boundaries. Our tribal partners, their agencies have a defined boundary of what Congress said, hey, this is what we recognize as your lands. This is what is your responsibility. So that's another look that, partners are going to have responsibilities defined on their boundaries. And there's going to be some limits as to what they can do outside those boundaries. Then you have other agencies such as the BLM. We don't have a boundary. We're not necessarily a single resource. We're a multiple use agency. And so, our mission takes us in many different paths. And when we don't have that boundary, that opens up a lot of doors for what we're involved in and where we can go. And so you put all those three different mixes in, and it brings an opportunity for everyone at the table to make sure they have a good understanding of what each partner is responsible for, and how that's going to affect what they can do in this master agreement. Ben, do you have anything to add?
Struggling to find the mute button there. No, I don't have anything to add there. Just to say it's complicated. Each state's different. You might be very familiar with the state that you normally work in, your home unit, but then you go help your friend out in another state. You cannot migrate. And this goes for all aspects of the master agreement, but particularly there, you can't migrate what you know from your master agreement in your state to another state. They're all unique. So some downstream effects, some things that may either be covered or not covered, and how they relate to your operating plan and just the way you do business. So think about the effort that goes into the master agreement, and it's pretty easy to skip over stuff, broad brush stuff, not make the time to put a lot of detail in. And at the same time, it's also very easy to paint yourself into a corner and put too much detail in. There's a balance there in what goes into a master agreement, and then subsequently how it gets implemented, both in the operating plan and then just out on the ground. And so as you look at your master agreement, also look at your operating plan and make sure that, if your master agreement is not entirely detailed, somewhere that detail needs to come out in an operating plan or elsewhere, so that you know how everything's going to work. There's clarity between partners and it avoids tension. Some of those examples of things that could get outlined specifically in operating plans, certainly some of the how into the operating plan, but also defining at a high level in the master agreement are things like how you're going to do dispatching, closest forces concept, things like that. How are you going to staff a dispatch center or do resource coordination efforts? How are you going to do training? A lot of our training centers are built under the auspices of a master agreement and the way we work together across agency boundaries, so we're not all putting on the same class individually, things like that. And then lately, we've started really branching out, doing things like spas and other type of subsequent agreement work under a master agreement, creating efficiencies between the agencies, specifically between Fed and state, to move out on projects. And so think about things like Good Neighbor Authority, some of our work that we're doing cross boundary at a landscape level. The master agreement can be a great tool to do that, especially when we're talking about fire related things like prescribed fire, fuels work, things of that sort, where there's a vested interest by all the parties, regardless of boundaries, regardless of fence lines, to do work, and the exchange of money primarily, and the exchange of resources. And so think about places where we could expand on that. That is something that's been in place for a while, but as we get the new iteration again, those older master agreements are expiring, and we're providing language into the new master agreements that allow avenues for this sort of thing to happen more and more, that enables us to move resources around, move money around, and do projects jointly, both fuels projects, prescribed fire, and things like that, but also things like facilities and the way we do like fire stations, dispatch centers, co-locating our efforts show up in that area as well. Dennis, anything else to add there?
No, I think that covers it. The take-home point there is be careful of what isn't covered in the master agreement, because it could produce a significant workload for the locals and how they try to cover all that. Okay, so let's go into financial reconciliation. So this is certainly one of the core functions, if not the core function of the master agreement, is it helps us provide that opportunity of how we're going to exchange funds back and forth. And so one of the biggest things that we need to be aware of is that this is a reimbursement, right? In the master agreement, it's pretty rare for us to say, hey, I'm going to pay you this much for you to do this. That might happen on a local level or even between a couple federal agencies if there's some preparedness or pre-suppression work that needs to happen. But the master agreement is really going to cover the suppression work, the unplanned work. And so that's why we go with mostly a reimbursement process. And so there's a couple ways that we are looking at this. So there's the prepay option where you're trading of protection responsibilities, and we'll get into that a little bit. Mutual aid is another one. We'll get into that in a little bit here. And then there's also the actual pay. So when a incident does happen, how we're going to reconcile that. And one of those is the cost share documentation, also commonly referred to as a cost share agreement. I'll get on my soapbox just a little bit. Cost share agreement, the CSA, it's not a standalone agreement. It's really a step down in implementing of the master agreement. So as you go through your cost share documentation, just remember, all of it is based off the master agreement. Many times our agency administrators get hung up because they don't know where to start. Go back to your master agreement. That's where that cost share documentation came from. That is the rules that you get to use to document it. And we're going to get into some examples here in just a little bit. All right. Next.
Yeah, and so Dennis just kind of alluded to some of the protection responsibilities, and that feeds into the way we do business together. And this is another one of those aspects that each master agreement is somewhat unique to, and each state is unique to. And so within the master agreement template and some of the guiding direction around the way we construct these master agreements, we have some authority to exchange protection. The important clarification there is that we're exchanging who has the financial responsibility to fight fire on that ground, but we are not necessarily removing jurisdictional authorities, the responsibility to manage that land, and it doesn't necessarily speak to who actually goes and fights the fire. It's just how they're going to get paid. And a couple of examples of that show up as Dennis was just mentioning. There's offset where we're trading acres. I'll protect this acre if you protect that acre, regardless of who owns it or who has jurisdictional authority. There's reciprocal fire protection. There's which is similar to mutual aid and things like that. There's a number of different options out there that work for doing protection responsibility within an agreement. And it's very important for you to know what your area has defined for within the master agreement for protection. That you still have the responsibilities, as I mentioned, for jurisdiction. And so that shows up in fire in places like assigning reads and a delegation of authority. For the federal agencies, you're still going to do a WFDSS decision. It does not abdicate you of that role. And it really, really reinforces the need to have a good working relationship with your partner that has the protection responsibility so that you understand what they're trying to do from a protecting standpoint, and that you can illustrate to them what your values are, why you would like things done the way you would as a jurisdictional agency holding that ground under your belt. A few other things to think about here. The pros and cons of all of this is, there are definitely different ways of doing business here. And when you think about the 4 types that are listed at the bottom of this slide, there are reasons why you might want to do one or the other. There is not a right way and a wrong way. They obviously exist for a reason, but think about some of the limitations that could apply to applying one of these in your area versus another. How much control do you want to have? What is jurisdictionally, what is the land management type for a certain piece of ground, and who is the best agency to implement that? If an agency has a a framework of putting fires out, smallest acres possible, things like that. And the end somewhat justifies the means, and you're likely to not have other goals met, land management goals met, like say wilderness ethic. That might not be a good fit. And so think about what might be the best protection responsibility type for that land base. And those show up down below. Again, offset, direct protection, that's the trading of acres. One agency protects another agency's acre to create a balance across the map. Reimbursable, Dennis, I believe, just talked about that a little bit, and it's going to show up around cost share information. But we're basically paying similar to the fee for service. We're reimbursing somebody else to protect a piece of ground. Fee for service, we're hiring somebody else. We're keeping responsibility for it, but we're going to hire somebody else based on closest forces and things of that. And then mutual aid, we're just doing reciprocal fire protection. We're all going to show up, and then eventually we're going to thank somebody else for their service and helping with that initial response. But when it's time to go, it's time to go, and we'll take it from here type of thing. A few things to think about, or at least one thing to think about when we talk about protection responsibility, though, is as you go through this process, it's going to drive how you do cost shares or who pays. And so feeding into what we're going to talk about here in a second, think about what capacity you have or your partner has to do cost share work. It puts a pretty big load, or could put a pretty big load, on the incident business staff that you have assigned to your incident, whether it's the finance section of an incident management team or just your incident business staff that's within your organization. Dennis, any other thoughts on that?
I think that's a great segue. Let's get into our cost share documentation itself. So the first thing is, when is it required? And basically what it comes down to is when you have multiple agencies that each have responsibility for a fire, then we need a cost share. There's a lot of times where folks go to great lengths to try to convince themselves that they don't need a cost share. And one thing I would really counsel against that. When we have multiple agencies there, cost shares do not have to be onerous. They do not have to be very complex. You make sure your cost share is tailored to your situation. And so, I'm going to cover one, the cover your own costs method. So if you're at an incident, multiple agencies have responsibility, multiple agencies have responded, but it's pretty quick, it's easy. You can see that it's very fairly equitable. Everyone's just going to cover their own costs. We don't need to do a cost share. Time out. You're setting yourself up for disaster in that. Because when it comes back later that, turns out the partner burned up a transmission, or some private property was burned, who's responsible for that? You really want to have that cost share documentation in place, because it just helps define exactly what you agreed to, and it can be simple. You're just writing it down. You're just making it part of the file so that everyone knows it. We can go back and refer it, and it's good to go. Other methodologies. So Shannon, you brought up a great point earlier, saying that, a lot of times agency administrators just want to press the easy button and either not do a cost share agreement or take on more than what they should. And I really counsel against that as well. We've had a history where federal agencies have been extremely generous on accepting a lot of cost and responsibility when it comes to these fires. And I'm here to tell you, our agencies, Congress, our leadership, they're not in that for that purpose anymore. There is an expectation, growing expectation, that we need to share that responsibility, and we need to appropriately document it. And so let's make sure we're not setting ourselves up in disaster. One of the few things that can do that, set you up for disaster, is at the beginning of the fire, call your partner, say, don't worry, we got this. You don't know where that fire is going. You don't know what it's going to be involved in. We're not in the business of shutting down mom and pop fire departments. That's not in our interest. We can tailor a cost share to take care of those situations, but give yourself options so that you're able to have a good resolution as you go along. Black acres, pretty easy to go through that, but percent effort, you order, you pay. Again, the point here is make sure that it's going to be a good balance of responsibility and cost for all the agencies involved, And that's what's going to help you get to a better point. So I know that we're out of time right now. I appreciate everyone's involvement. Ben, did you have anything that you wanted to close with?
Yeah, just that last slide, the next slide, really what this all boils down to is the relationship that you have with your peers from the other agencies. That's what's going to make these master agreements successful as you go to implement them. So think about how well of a relationship you've built with your peers in your partner agencies, and don't wait for the incident for smoke to be in the air to try to do that. The better job you do of doing that ahead of time, the better off you'll be when the day comes that you need to have these conversations. There's a couple of questions in the chat. I think, Dennis, maybe you and I can just respond to them in the chat to save us some time and kick it back to Casey.
Yeah, and if you guys have any more questions, Robert, Blanco, get those questions in there. If we have time at the end of the presentation, possibly go back there, but yeah, Dennis and Dan, I would say just answer those in the chat. All right, I'm gonna switch to my presentation. We're gonna try to launch a 2 different polls right now. So if it works, it works. If it doesn't, we'll just move on. Oh, there they go. So if you could start filling out those polls for us, just kind of get a base of who our audience is, and it'll also kind of persist if you don't click an answer on that one. All right, am I sharing the same slides, folks? Ben and Dennis on there. Get those poll answers still coming in. Here's the second poll that just jumped up there. All right. Thanks, Ben and Dennis, for that experience, sharing experience on that and discussion on that. There's a lot of information in that one. Like I said, thanks again for sharing your experience on that. It's super relevant. Jonah, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
All right. So I want to introduce Jonah Bond. After 15 years in primary fire, Jonah transitioned to the WFM RD&A data team in August of 2023. He'll now share his experience with you. Go ahead, Jonah.
All right. Good afternoon. Yeah, I'm here to talk about presumptive illness for federal wildland firefighters through the OWCP program. I'm going to be sharing, or why I'm talking about this is because I have some firsthand knowledge. As I'm the first Forest Service firefighter to be covered for cancer under these policies. In January of 2022, I had a grand mal seizure at home that led to the discovery of a brain tumor. Unfortunately, this brain tumor turned out to be cancerous. In March of that year is when I found out that it was actually cancer, not just benign. And then I started my chemotherapy and radiation treatment about a month later in early April. I was in my first or second week of that radiation treatment when FECA Bulletin 2207 came out. So the Federal Employee Compensation Act. This was released by Secretary of Labor and those folks at OWCP. This bulletin kind of changed the way we looked at cancer and other serious diseases with firefighters. Before this, your doctor had to basically say that there was 100% that the injury or accident that you have was because of your job. Now with Bulletin 2207, They just stated that your employment as a firefighter was capable of producing this new diagnosed condition. When this bulletin came out, yeah, like I said, I was just started my radiation treatment, and people recommended that I should apply. My wife and I went back and forth for a while because we'd been through the OWCP process before, knew that it had some hurdles, and we're pretty nervous. I had insurance at this time that had covered all my bills. It was we're pretty solidly into my treatment at this time. So I figured, why not? So we ended up applying through a CA2 with the Forest Service. Eventually that got to OWCP, and my first claims manager actually denied my case because he said there's no doctor's note there that proved my cancer was caused by my employment. So I had to reach back out to him, like, hey, have you seen FECA Bulletin 2207? Because my understanding is it's a different process now and you don't need to prove it. He had not seen it yet. He was unaware this bulletin had been released and unaware of the policy changes that it included. Due to that delay, took over 2 months for my claim to be approved. But in June of 22, my OWCP claim for cancer was approved. Yeah. Just because it was approved doesn't mean things were easy. I had at that point, 6 months of bills that had been gone through my private insurance that I paid out of pocket, etc. Another big issue was that my chemotherapy was a pill. So it was an oral process, not an IV line. So that meant that it had to go through OWCP's subcontracted prescription program. They, of course, had never approved chemotherapy before, and they had no idea how to do it. I ended up reaching out to both my US senators at the time, July and August there, to try to get my chemotherapy approved. I was supposed to, continue on chemotherapy after 6 months after my radiation, and that deadline was quickly approaching. I did get approved for chemo, and it did show up in time, but it was an ordeal. Then I also had to work with the insurance company, my Forest Service case manager, and all the hospitals to try to retroactively bill 6 months, including brain surgery, radiation for 6 weeks, etc. At the time, this bulletin was just released by OWCP and DOL, so it wasn't actually any kind of federal law. At any point, DOL could change their mind. The White House, Congress could change how this worked. Luckily, in December of that year, Congress got together and included this in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. So they rolled this in to create federal law that would keep this going for longer. I believe some work on the PACT Act probably helped push this through. So it now states that certain illnesses and disease are presumed to be work-related. So you no longer have to prove that it absolutely was caused by your employment. It was just very likely caused by your employment. As you can see here on the slide, a number of cancers and diseases that were included in that initial release in December of 2022. There's also language there included that they're going to continue to track what people apply with, follow the most recent science to potentially include more stuff in the future. So who is actually eligible for this presumptive illness coverage? They have some pretty discrete policy there of what they want to cover. There's links to all this included in that Word document. There's in the beginning, so I'm not going to read all of it word for word. But there's policies there as far as You have to be trained in fire suppression, have the legal authority and responsibility to engage in fire suppression. Important thing here is it can be retroactive, right? So you can be diagnosed years later and still be covered. Going back to that retroactive thing, when I applied for my CA2, I put down my date of injury as March 15th, which is the day I received my actual cancer diagnosis. I later found out that that date of injury should be in January, when I had my seizure that found the brain tumor. If I wanted to include all the bills and work loss, et cetera, that was included with my disease. So that's important to include that date of injury retroactively. Yeah, so other things with who's eligible: must be employed for not less than 5 years in aggregate. So seasonal employees can be covered here if all their time stacks up to 5 years. And then there's that date. You have up to 10 years after your last active date of employment to be covered. There are some heart conditions as well that must be more recent. I think 24 hours on those ones. I've got Aaron Phelps here to back me up after I'm done, so I'll just continue with my story. So also included in the NDAA was the First Responder Fair Retire Act. So not only did we get coverage for these diseases for workers' comp, but finally they decided that disabled employees that were covered under this shouldn't have to lose their special retirement if they're no longer able to do their primary fire job. So this also includes law enforcement, custom, border patrol, and all federal firefighters. So basically this is stating that once you're approved and you can no longer do your primary job, you can either move into a secondary fire or non-fire job, and you should be able to keep your retirement. Couple final thoughts. Things that I learned along the way. So, like I said, there was a certain list that was approved in that first NDAA in December of 22, but it also stated that other diseases would be reviewed over time to be added to that list. Now, one thing I've heard is that the more people apply and the more numbers they get with these diseases that they can relate will also help get those added officially. So like, just because something isn't currently on that list doesn't mean that it won't be covered in the future. So you should apply. Same thing with this eligibility definition. Don't assume that you aren't covered just because of that. And those claims can be retroactive. So it's up to 10 years after your last employment date. So even if you're no longer with the Forest Service, retired or moved on or whatever else, you're still eligible. So if you have no friends or coworkers that are having issues beyond their employment, they're still eligible. So when you apply, there's a couple of things that took some going back and forth between my HR case manager and OWCP that helped me. So I figured it would help folks who are either applying or helping folks apply in the future. So you need an official diagnosis from a doctor that lists the illness you've been diagnosed with, whether it's one of those ones that are currently eligible or one that might be added in the future. To prove or indicate my fire protection duties, I put in my current position description and my red card, which says that here, I'm supposed to be doing these fire duties. And then I use my IQCS master record to indicate my whole length of fire exposure from 2008, when I was 18 years old, all the way till 2022. I was a type 2 burn boss like 2 months before that seizure occurred. And then to verify the 5 years in aggregate, my HR case manager pulled together my SF50s of my start and end time. I was not a permanent employee that whole 5 years before my injury, so a lot of that seasonal time they were able to track through those SF50s. So in the end, you know, when this came out, I was very hesitant to apply. You've all heard the war stories or the horror stories about, you know, some of the OWCP claims that have either been denied or even though they're approved, they're a struggle every day, like mine was, still is to this day. But I have to say it was absolutely worth it. The way they were able to retroactively cover my hospital bills. I mean, my brain surgery alone was $25,000, not to mention 6 weeks of radiation. If you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. Otherwise, Aaron Phelps is going to follow up with some more specifics and kind of where we are at now with all this. So thanks for your time. I appreciate it. And I recommend that, yeah, you support anyone who's going through this as much as the support I got. It was greatly appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Jonah, for sharing that story. Like Jonah said, we're gonna introduce Aaron Phelps. Minimize this. We have a bunch of questions coming in, so we'll kind of try to get to some of them in the chat. If not, we will try to provide those answers at the end. We will have a recording of this this whole workshop at the end, and I'll walk you folks how to get credit for that, and how to get access to that as well. And then Aaron can answer maybe some of these questions. So I now want to introduce Aaron Phelps, who is the Assistant Director for Doctrine, Learning, and Risk Management of the U.S. Forest Service WO Fire and Remediation Management. She currently is the agency's lead in development and implementation of a federal wildland firefighter health and well-being program in partnership with the Department of the Interior. Formerly, Aaron was a branch chief, district ranger, project manager, and primary firefighter. You know, she lives with her husband, toddler, and 3 dogs in Idaho. So, Aaron, you want to take it away?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Casey. And thank you, Jonah, for starting this conversation off, I think, in the right way, too, is how impactful our firefighters' health are, especially with some of the new developments in our system from Congress and some of our partners in different areas as well, too. So like Jonah mentioned, I'm here to go a little bit bigger picture and kind of the tie-in with what we're doing at the federal level with Interior and the Forest Service. And so I'm starting it off with this slide, that Federal Wildland Firefighter Health and Wellbeing Program. And so I'm trying to get more brand familiarity with the title of this program because it encompasses what Jonah talked about with the FY23 National Defense Authorization Act and presumptive illnesses, and a lot of other stuff in the system, including firefighter health and well-being, mental health and well-being as well. So next slide, we'll start talking a little bit about just the current legislation that is giving us the authority to move out on some of these things. And then I'm not going to go super deep into the behavioral health side of things, but I am available for more follow-up to conversations or presentations as needed as well. So wanted to highlight, I think probably everybody on this call is very familiar with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act bill. So I wanted to highlight 2 things from this. The first one is that Congress did tell us that we needed to develop and adhere to recommendations for mitigation strategies for wildland firefighters to minimize exposures due to line of duty environmental hazards. So that is an ongoing effort that kind of dovetails into the National Defense Authorization Act, which I'll get to on the next slide. And then the second one, which kind of tiers to some of the questions in the chat, we were directed to establish programs for permanent, temporary, seasonal, and year-round wildland firefighters to recognize and address mental health needs, including PTSD care. And so that is the first time we've had legal authority or legislative authority to move out and develop mental health programs. And it is specific to wildland firefighters. I want to call that out. However, the bill didn't specifically define what a firefighter is. So take with that what you will. The next slide kind of dives into what Jonah already mentioned too. You know, the specific fairness for federal firefighters did have this huge change in the presumptive illness coverage, which you heard Jonah walk through. That is huge because it's really the first time, again, that we've had this kind of like giant recognition that what we do causes cancer. I mean, there's been a bunch of other stuff kind of beforehand, but this is the biggest one. And then it also directed both the Department of Interior and Agriculture, Forest Service, to conduct a long-term health study. So this is that dovetail into the previous slide about what are we doing with our firefighter community in terms of exposure, and how are we mitigating, and how is that tying into some of these long-term illnesses that are part of the presumptive illness side of the house as well. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go super deep into this, but Jonah mentioned there are avenues for Department of Labor Secretary to add illnesses and cancers to that list. The act itself, the NDAA, did call out breast cancer and reproductive cancers, and of course rhabdo as well. And so they basically just have to have enough rationale and data to support why those things and other cancers and illnesses should be added to the list. So next slide. So with the two slides I just talked about, those are kind of our legislative authorities to move out on these things. There's others at play as well in some of the column on the right. But this slide, I just really wanted to touch on Forest Service and Interior with what we're doing with a firefighter health and wellbeing program. We recognized fairly early on that we couldn't just focus on kind of one silo and then another silo. So for example, we couldn't just focus on behavioral health and then kind of like move out separately with like long-term health or environmental and occupational health. And we heard pretty loudly from our firefighters too, that you can't divorce them from each other. And so we moved towards this comprehensive approach. And so we are really in the beginning stages of rolling this program out. We kind of finalized our operating or governance structures between Interior and Forest Service last fall. But we are starting to communicate more broadly about some of the things that we're going to be offering in 2024 for our firefighting community. So that's another probably presentation too. But we're looking at where the most pressing gaps and how do we fill them, and how do we use what we're doing to inform longer term services, both for the Forest Service or both for firefighters and for the broader Forest Service as well. So on the topic for today, the presumptive illnesses coverage and NDAA, we've noticed over and over again that our folks aren't hearing about it enough. And that includes our retiree community, includes like volunteers and AD, and then also includes just our primary firefighters as well. And so that's kind of my plug throughout this presentation is we really need folks to know about what the law change really means. And like Jonah's story demonstrated, to give it a chance, because it really is worth it to inform a lot of different things. So next slide, we'll go into what did we see last year. So it was the first year with this act in place. So we had roughly 30 cases, both within the Interior and Forest Service, were submitted to Department of Labor, OWCP, and adjudicated. The vast majority of those were the Forest Service. I believe Interior had 2. And one of the ones from Interior was previously a 20-year employee of the Forest Service and had just moved over to Interior. Each case is unique, and that sounds kind of trite, but it really isn't. Every single one of those cases, plus everyone that we've seen since the end of last year, has really had some nuances. So I get the question a lot, like, how do you best inform people on like how to fill out, the CA2 and their paperwork to make sure that they kind of get through the process. And I think what Jonah mentioned in his slides is spot on. I'll go into stuff on the next slide as well, but every case is so unique. It's hard to say, okay, it takes this amount of time, it takes this amount of energy, and takes exactly this paperwork. Some cases, you have like a single instance, you work through it, you get coverage, and it's done. Some, like Jonah mentioned too, we have some where it's multiple cancers. Some of them are long-term. They've been in remission on one, but they're receiving treatment for others. And so they have to provide kind of different paperwork for that. It's all kind of over the place. And so it's just what we're trying to, again, double down on is do the paperwork and get through the process. And we have a huge support network in place at HR, and then of course at WFAM to help support our folks as they go through this too. So then the special claims unit within Department of Labor, OWCP. So this was one of the FICA bulletins that Jonah referenced as well. It's a special claims unit specifically for firefighting cases, wildland firefighting cases, and it really did expedite the processing of claims by roughly 50%. So it dropped it down from roughly 180 days to 90. And that's kind of at both ends of the spectrum. We saw a Forest Service retiree who had been retired from the Forest Service for 5 years, submit a claim and have it be adjudicated within 10 days. So, and then some of them go all the way up to 90 or a little bit beyond as well. So again, all over the place, but that's still a huge win. This one, I think some of the questions might have come up with this too. So we've seen claims be submitted by current employees, former employees, so folks that worked for the Forest Service or Interior and then just are in different occupations or not primary fire anymore, retirees, and then by survivors on behalf of deceased wildland firefighters. And that one's a heartbreaker for sure. We've had some folks submit claims while they're in treatment or while they're in hospice and then pass away before their claim was adjudicated. But we've seen all of those cases be adjudicated in terms of from those categories. So question comes up a lot about how long does it take to get the payment to? And so what we've seen is once a claim is accepted by OWCP, it can take up to 1 to 2 weeks from the date approved for the monthly compensation benefits to be paid out. Sometimes it's less, sometimes a little bit more, but that's kind of like generally what we're seeing is 1 to 2 weeks. And next slide. So to continue on what we're learning from it too, just to add on from what Jonah had in his presentation, if folks are submitting a claim thinking it's going to fall under the presumptive illness claim with the Federal Firefighter Fairness Act, say that up front in the narrative, both on the supervisor side and the employee submitting, as well as just key in, use that language. This is a claim for illness covered by Firefighter Fairness Act, presumptive illness. And that'll help kind of flag it for our internal Forest Service, HR, workers' comp, and then of course, Department of Labor as well. So folks will get a copy of this PowerPoint, and I linked in 2 things as well. So this OWCP fact sheet is also really helpful for folks who are trying to understand, like, should I submit a claim or not? Or what does it look like and how do I navigate that system? So we've been really pointing people to that. We do meet regularly, Department of Labor, with Department of Labor and Department of Interior to talk about how things are going. What have we learned? Is there anything we need to do or communicate out to our folks to better navigate the system? And that fact sheet is a result of those conversations. I would also say that we're coming up on kind of the 1-year mark for reporting out. So Department of Labor Secretary is required to report out, I think it's the end of April is when they're planning on doing it. What are the cases that they're seeing? What kinds of cancers are firefighters reporting? What's not on the list that maybe should be on the list? And that's going to be kind of that first real glimpse into what does this look like for our folks from an all federal standpoint. Employees, I didn't put this on there, but just for awareness, if you as a supervisor too didn't know this, employees are not required to do this through eSafety. Depending on what they might Google or see on DOL, OWCP, or multiple websites, folks can go just through the OWCP e-comp process. However, we are strongly encouraging folks to go through our eSafety Forest Service process, because that's how we can support them. So if folks just go right to e-comp, the Forest Service, HR, we can't like backtrack into that. They're kind of on their own to navigate the system. So that's always an option, but it really does remove the ability to have a case manager and support network. The FICA bulletin is referenced on there, and I think that's also on Jonah's presentation. DOL, OWCP is working hard to streamline the process and remove barriers. So in the meetings I've had with Chris Godfrey, their newer director, he is really listening to the field. And so that's where it's not the same OWCP as years in the past. I know, like, I think all of us probably have bad experiences with OWCP. However, they really are trying to be responsive, and they're trying to remove barriers, including the fact that where a lot of our folks are located is in remote areas without a whole surplus of like medical providers. So they're changing their system to better accommodate some of those cases too. And so the last thing I mentioned is a different kind of support needed. So why I started off with the kind of comprehensive health umbrella and then moved into more of the presumptive illness is, like I mentioned before, we can't like silo these things away from each other. And we're recognizing, especially with the cancer and long-term illnesses for our folks, not only do they need a different level of support to navigate like the workers comp side and OWCP, but it's a different level of support just on like the mental health side as well. And so, this is depend on the situation because they're all different, but it's a different kind of weight. We know that on our folks. And it's also, in the hopefully fortunate event that folks recover, if they come back to these positions or this support work, they're going back to what potentially gave them the cancer. And that's a different kind of mental strain as well. And so we are keeping that in mind and trying to think through how best to set up like informal peer-to-peer kind of support. We'll call it like cancer survivorship program development. And that's on our radar for rolling out too, but it's also just for awareness for supervisors on this call and to communicate out to that there's just different levels of support needed. And HR is staffing up on their workers' comp side to be able to be responsive to this. But it also, we know that it falls a lot on direct supervision as well. So one of the things I kind of glossed over, but it gets to Thomas's question on here too, that second part of the long-term health study. So, and it also ties into the bill language as well, is that we can't just say, okay, what we do is giving you cancers and long-term illnesses, go to OWCP and we'll cover it for you. We also have to be proactive on that mitigation side. And so that's the long-term health study that we're working with CDC, NIOSH, and Interior, and a bunch of others on standing that up to better understand what is it specifically in terms of like thresholds with different kinds of exposures, not just smoke, but there's a lot of stuff in the soils that we are operating in, ash, soot, et cetera, that we need to know more about so we know how to manage and mitigate effectively too. So I know I'm out of time, but there's my contact information too, and I'll kind of scroll back up on the chat and see if I can answer some more questions. But I think like Michael put in the chat and like Jonah said, if folks have questions, if they went through cancer, like years ago and are wondering, should I submit a claim? Please do. It helps with the whole notification system. It helps make the system better. And it helps hopefully pave the path for other folks to go through it more effectively too. So with that, turn it back to you, Casey.
No, thanks, Erin. That's a lot of information. Like Erin said, there's a few questions in the chat. Kip, we'll try to get to yours. It's a good question. We didn't provide the PowerPoint slides in the chat, but we'll try to get them on the agency administrative toolbox for you guys since there's so much information on here. Also, go ahead and check out that Word doc that Tammy sent out. That'll have some of the links that are posted throughout the different presentations. All right, we're gonna jump back over to WFDSS now. I want to introduce Morgan Pence. She's currently on the WFDSS business team. She's worked for the Wildland Fire Management RD&A for many years, supporting wildland fire decisions and including fire modeling and analysis. Today, she's providing the WFDSS update for us. So take it away, Morgan.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Morgan, and like Casey said, I work for the Wildland Fire Management RD&A, and I'll cover some WFDSS updates for everyone. And to start with, I just want to remind everybody why we use WFDSS. So it's the decision support system for the federal agencies, and it's required for the documentation of the decisions you make on wildland fires on federal incidents. And as such, it does not create or set any policy, but it's used by you folks, the agency administrators and the fire managers, to ensure that policy and guidance is followed and documented in an official repository. So the application itself has many supporting tools and data to aid in your risk-informed decision-making process. It's important that you get your decisions documented in WFDSS as that official record. Go to, yeah, there you go. So today I'm going to cover the new access that we've put into WFDSS since November. I'll cover the updates we've made to the organizational assessment, Part D in the wildland fire risk and complexity analysis, and then I'll talk a little bit about the pod data. Okay, so let's talk about access. If you haven't signed into WFDSS since November 29th of 2023, so just after Thanksgiving, you're going to want to access WFDSS before you need it for training or for production real fires, because we've changed the access method. In the next couple slides, I'm going to show you what that looks like. So if you want to follow along or watch the video later and have a question, you'll have that. But first, let me just describe what the steps are. Previously, you had to have a password that you changed every 60 days to access the system, but that is no more. So now users access the system using their PIV card or using a login.gov account. So many agency employees will likely use your PIV card, but I want to make it clear that the login.gov option is available for anyone. It's not just for the non-agency members that don't have PIV cards. You can use login.gov from any of the users can use login.gov, whereas the PIV card access, you actually have to have PIV. And using a device that reads your PIV card or a mobile link, some of the devices we have the option for a mobile link for PIV card access. So in order for your account in WFDSS, in order for this to work, your account in WFDSS, the email that's in there, it must match the email that's on your PIV card if you're using your PIV card, or if you're using login.gov, that email has to match the email in your login.gov. If the emails don't match between WFDSS and your PIV or your login.gov account, you will not get in. And I will cover like what you can do about that, because there's a way to fix that. But that's the key thing. The emails have to match. Okay, so the good news is the bookmarks that, if you had bookmarks set for accessing WFDSS before I made this change, those all still work. You don't have to find a different way to get to WFDSS. You can sign in from the homepage, or if you had the production and training pages bookmarked, those will still work. Or you can just Google WFDSS, that's fine too. So if you're using production or training, you just select the large button that says login. And if you're using the homepage, I'm showing these on the screen. If you're using the homepage, you can select access production or access training. After selecting one of those options, you'll be taken to the Wildland Fire application portal page, where you will select login.gov or eAuth, which is your PIV card, depending on which option you want to go. And although this screen indicates that government employees would use eAuth, I just want to repeat again, anybody can use the login.gov. So agency employees can also use that option. If you use login.gov, you'll be taken to a page that has you sign in to that account. And if you're using this, like I said, the email has to match. So for example, you could have your WFDSS account might be set up with your agency email, but if your login.gov account is set up with a personal Gmail or maybe your FireNet account, they're not gonna talk to each other. It has to be the same email. So you would need a login.gov account that uses the same email that WFDSS has. And again, I'll cover that in a minute, but I'm going to walk you through if you selected the PIV card option, because likely many of the federal folks here would be using that option. So after you select eAuth, this should all be hopefully really familiar to you. You would pick the PIV option, or if you're trying to get in through mobile link and your device lets you do that, you can select that option, and then you will be prompted for your PIN. This should be familiar, hopefully, to everybody. And then you will be taken to the Wildland Fire application portal page, which I'm showing two views of that page, but this is what the Wildland Fire application portal page looks like if you're not familiar with it. The reason why I'm showing two views is I just wanted people to follow along if they're watching offline and their screen doesn't look exactly like mine, because there's two views. You can look at it with the logo view, or you can look at it with the tiles view, and it just changes a little look and feel of what the page looks like and what the icons look like. So if you've not accessed WFDS yet, since we made this change, you're going to need to search for the tile or the logo for WFDS. There'll be a list of all the applications that are on this page, and you're going to need to search for it. And then you can favorite it. So you favorite the tile by selecting the star with a little plus button, and then that saves that tile or that logo under your My Production or My Training applications, and then you don't have to search for it every time you come in. So once you've got it favorited, then you can click on the tile or the logo for WFDS Production or WFDS Training, whichever one you want that you're trying to get into. But before I move from the screen, I wanted to point out that there is another tile or logo that you will see that also has WFDS in the name. Under the My Training on my screen, you will see a logo that's called WFDS NG, that stands for NextGen UAT, and that stands for User Acceptance Testing. So this is the new WFDS that we're building. That's the access point to that system. And because they both have WFDS in the name, I just wanted to draw your attention to it. We are not using WFDS NextGen for fire season 2024 for your production real live incidents. You need to keep using the same old WFDS that you're used to. And that's the logo with the red flame that has the black circle around it. But you'll see this other one here. And the next presenter is going to talk about NextGen. Okay, so after you select the tile or the logo that you want, you will be put into the system so long as your email matches the PIV, or the email from your PIV or login.gov account matches. If you get a message that says no account exists, then we're going to talk about what to do, because what that means is the email in your WFDS account does not match what you tried to do. And this can happen for several reasons. The most common is because you've changed an agency and therefore your emails aren't matching. Like what WFDS has is not what your new agency PIV card has. And then in some lesser common scenarios, we are finding that there's some users whose PIV card has an alias email that's slightly different and a derivation of the email that's on their PIV card. So think if your name is Dave, but your PIV card has an email address with David. This is not a common scenario. So I don't want anybody to think just because they're going by a short name that this is going to be their issue. It's a less common issue. But in any case, if you find out you can't get in, you need to contact the IIA help desk, and we have information for them on the WFDS homepage. And you tell them that you can't get into your account and that there's no account found. And the help desk should be able to locate your account and update the email for you. If they have any trouble doing that, the help desk will escalate the ticket to tier 2, which is the Wildland Fire Management RD&A, which gets a hold of the team that I work for. And one of us will find your account and get the email updated, and we'll stay on the phone or the chat with you to make sure that you can get in. And if you've never accessed WFDS and you get no account found, it's because you don't have one. And so you can create one from there. And we also have a link on the homepage for new users. Okay, let me shift to the organizational assessment update. In December of 2022, the Wildland Fire Risk and Complexity Assessment, known as the PMS 236, was updated to include a Part D, functional complexity. As a reminder, WFDS is just a tool. It's not creating or setting policy. It's just the mechanism to help you use that. But WFDS was not able to incorporate that Part D for fire season 2023 because the turnaround was just too tight with other security updates we were making. But we do now have the Part D incorporated, and I'll just show you briefly what that looks like. So users will complete the risk assessment. Oh, did it? There we go, thanks. Just making sure my slide caught up. Users will complete the risk assessment like you always have. And then at the end of the org assessment, you'll be shown a screen that looks like this, where you select if it's a type 5, a type 4, a type 3, or a type 1 or 2/CIMT. If you select type 1 or 2 CIMT, then you'll be required to do Part D. which looks like, next slide. It looks like this. So just like the PMS 236, users select low, moderate, high for the 5 functional categories of command, planning, operations, finance, and logistics. And then the system requires you to put notes in after you complete each section. And then you will select publish at the end to complete it. And this will automatically be added to your incident decision. Part D here at this screen is only required when the organizational assessment type that you select is the type 1 or 2/CIMT. You will not get this, this Part D if you select type 5, 4, or 3. Okay, and a little bit about the pod data. We added the pod data, which stands for potential operational delineations, to WFDS in July of last year. So you may already be familiar with it, but it's still a fairly new addition. So we wanted to cover it here. The pod areas represent polygons of pre-planned areas that could possibly defined by control features like your roads or your ridges with relevant information, where relevant information can be summarized. The lines represent the control features that form those polygons. So for units that are utilizing the pod service, you can find your polygons and lines on all the maps in WFDS just above the unit fire planning. I'm kind of showing on the screen there where you would find it. And this data is summarized in incident values inventory and included in your decision content. The pod feature service is open for all of the agencies to use, and the guide is available from the RMA dashboard. We don't have a live connection to that data. We pull static data, and we will be doing that twice this year. Already March 1st has passed. We made a pull then, and then we get it into WFDS, and we're going to make another pull from the RMA group on June 1st. So if you know that you want data in here and you don't have it, it's got to be in the pod service by June 1st for us to capture it for this fire season. And if you have any questions about if your unit has or is using the pod data, I would start by working with your WFDS data manager, which is the person that loads the shapes and languages that are associated with your unit's land and resource management plan. And that is all I have. I will be watching the chat to see if there's any WFDS classic questions. Otherwise, we can move on to Sam.
Thanks, Morgan. We're going to kick off a brief intro to next generation WFDS with Sam Amato. He is the next gen WFDS business team lead. So kick it off, Sam.
Thanks, Casey. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we got you.
Okay. I'll make this go pretty quick, and then you can direct any questions in the chat to me, or you can reach me offline as well. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Casey. So couple key updates on WFDS NextGen. We are going to try and get training online spring, summerish this year. However, you can get into WFDS NextGen UAT. I'll put a disclaimer there that the UAT environment is a development environment. So there's a lot of incomplete features in there. We reset the database quite often. So it's not necessarily the most stable environment, but if you're really itching to get a look at WFDS NextGen, you can request access, like Morgan showed you, through the Interagency Wildland Fire Application Portal, and just click on that. It'll walk you through the steps to get set up in INAP, and then it'll send the request, and somebody on the NextGen team will then approve that account. Demos, we'll do those on request. We've been doing them for various regional kind of, sometimes as low as forester unit refreshers at the beginning of the season, people that are just curious about WFDS NextGen. If you're not going to be having a demo locally, we do record those sometimes. So if you just want to watch one of the recordings, you can contact me and I can get that to you. I'll also mention, and I don't have it on the slide here, but if you go to the WFM RD&A website. There's a page on there for WFDS NextGen. And if you click on that, you can sign up to get on some of our user groups where we'll be demoing various functionality and gathering feedback. Which brings me to the last point on this slide, which is we depend on that feedback to make adjustments to the application, make sure it's working the best it can for the AAs and line officers who are the primary users of WFDS. We built most of the UI based on feedback from user experience gathered up from 2009. So we really rely on that. And there's a breakdown of all that user feedback. We have a whole inventory of it and which feedback has been incorporated and which is set to be incorporated. You can go to the next slide, Casey. This is just a quick snapshot kind of demo. I packed a bunch of stuff on here. I'll just mention a couple things that are pretty key about WFDS NextGen. One of them is that we're going to be utilizing services. So Morgan covered pods and your deadline to get your data updated so that they can pull it into the system. WFDS NextGen will be using services. So, you know, if you update your pods within the next hour, you would see that in WFDS NextGen. We don't manually load that stuff into the system. We just rely on those services to feed it. Some other things we're going to be doing is taking the spatial fire planning data that's in WFDS Classic. We're going to be moving that into a standalone service. That process has already begun. We're, I think, on version 80 or something now. We pull all the spatial fire planning data out of Classic, wrap that into the service, and then we pull that directly into WFDS NextGen. So some of that data you can actually look at in WFDS NextGen. And then the other thing we're going to be doing that I wanted to mention is we're going to be utilizing a automated planning area. So as soon as you start a decision, we'll automate a planning area creation, at least your initial one. You can draw a subsequent planning area if you want. But by creating that automated planning area, we're going to be able to do all kinds of stuff automatically for AAs and line officers to get you as much information as possible at the front end of the decision. And then you can enhance that later with an analyst or a SOPL or a read. But we're going to automatically go out and grab things like Matt Jolly's season ending analysis. We're looking at potentially automating FS Pro, so at least you have a basic FS Pro to look at. Automated flam map and minimum travel time, and bringing all that information together into your decision in places like relative risk and org assessment, so that you have that information right at your fingertips. And the last thing I'll mention about WFDS NextGen that's I think really going to help people out is once you're in an incident, you never leave the map. So you can minimize the map by sliding that right-hand panel left and right, but you never have to leave the map to fill out any part of your decision, whether that's your course of action, your relative risk, your org assessment. You always have the map available so that you can use that information in the context of your decision. I think those are the high points. Any quick questions? I think we have a couple minutes.
No, I don't see a lot of questions. The biggest thing is maybe just talk about the difference when requesting access for NextGen versus Classic. Well, that was a bunch.
Oh yeah, well, not much of a difference. When you click on the NextGen tile though, one thing that will happen is you'll get walked through an INAP profile setup, but the system will walk you through that. The other part of that is in WFDS NextGen, we really simplified the roles. So you're only going to need one role for WFDS NextGen. And for the purposes of the folks on this call, really all you need to request is editor access. Anything else?
More questions for Sam or Morgan?
Sam, there's a question in the chat from Jason Kiken about status of incorporating the RMA dashboard and ISAP into WFDSS NextGen.
Oh, sure. Well, RMA dashboard. Casey, can you step back to that previous slide, actually? So some parts of the RMA dashboard are mainly data layers. This is the SDI, I believe, is what I put up on the screen there. So as long as those data layers are available in a service, we can bring them into WFDSS NextGen. So a lot of the RMA layers are already in WFDSS NextGen. SDI is in there, PCL is in there, snag hazard, the old WFDSS ground evac, and then we're keeping in contact with Rick Stratton so we can get the new ground evac into WFDSS NextGen. Other parts of RMA dashboard, I mentioned Matt Jolly's season ending analysis. That's available as a service, so we can bring that in. And then the ISAP part, that's going to be more integrated into the decision. So ISAP is basically a work process that ties in a lot with WFDSS and a whole bunch of other risk decision support products. If you get into WFDSS UAT and you go to the tab that's highlighted on this screen, actually, which is a tab called Strategic Assessment, you'll be able to see how your management requirements will get tied into your decision. This is basically where your incident objectives and requirements are going to live. And we've incorporated critical values at risk onto that tab. So if you had a cultural resource or a natural resource like spotted leopard frog, you could identify that shape from your management requirement layer that would come in through the spatial fire planning service. And then you could fill out your concerns as a critical value at risk and what the potential is for that being impacted by your fire. Does that get it, Jason? Okay. And if you have more questions or you want to talk more about it, feel free to reach out to me offline.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam,
Mhm.
for giving that demonstration. I'm going to walk through quickly, so we're running out of time. So we're going to go how to get your cert. For your Forest Service folks, you need a certificate for your completion. Go back to the Wildland Fire Learning. Oh, okay. Thanks, Jason. We noted your question. Go back to the Wildland Fire Learning portal, select Find Learning, and then you'll see in the search you can put 2024 Agency Administrator WFDSS, and there'll be that top option. Select that. If you go to the next page and you haven't enrolled yourself already, it's a self-enrollment. Click on that enroll me, and then that gives you access to the feedback, and the feedback is required to obtain your certificate. All right. Thank you for attending this. Put a lot of effort into it. All these folks. Thanks for the presenters that took their time to volunteer. Thanks to the WFDSS, both Classic and NextGen teams. If you have any questions, we always have the on-call phone support. And then if you want to reach out to anybody specifically, and hopefully kind of direct you where you need to go. So, John, Forest Service is the one that requires that certificate. So it's up to you. You can print it out as well. You give it to your training officer. All right, if you don't have any more questions, thank you for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.